Good afternoon and welcome. We invite you to come in and have your seat so that we can get started. And welcome to our dialogue this afternoon, Water Insecurity in an Uncertain World. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I know that many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson. And one of the things that we try to focus on is really getting a sense of what are key critical development priorities right now and what's the opportunity space for action. And it's within that context that we are really delighted to have two panels that will be looking at the connections between water and security. What do we know? What are we learning? What are the practical implications and what action can be taken now and in the next, in the immediate future? Jane Harmon, our president, CEO, and director of the center, describes us as an intellectual candy shop. So we're exploring a lot of ideas where you don't get fat on spin. So I think that's a really good dimension. So we're addressing a really critical development issue, but we're not looking at the spin on that issue. How can we move above and beyond to really look at this issue from a critical and analytical perspective? And in that context, we're always very delighted to have key development partners that work with us, like colleagues at the Henry M. Jackson Foundation and at USAID's, in particular USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. It is with their support that we've been able to host this event today. And I'd like to invite a couple colleagues from the Henry M. Jackson Foundation to tell us a little bit about why they think the issue that we're working on today is so important and salient, both for the foundation and as a critical issue. So John Hampelman is the president of the board of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation and worked on the Senate staff of Senator Jackson as well as the senator's presidential campaigns. He's one of the founding partners and chairman of the Carnos and Hampelman, a full-service Seattle law firm. So John, I invite you up. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. The Jackson Foundation is very, very pleased to be here and partnering with the Wilson Center on this issue. In fact, we have a long history of partnership with the center. We were here even Monday on another very, very relevant program where we partnered with the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. Most of you will remember, or at least remember, the legacy of Scoop Jackson, our senator from Washington State, who was a very, very influential and forward-thinking member of the Congress, particularly focused on issues like national security, national defense, natural resources, issues like water security, and how there can be, even during his tenure, instability in the world if we don't address those issues. So the foundation is committed to continuing that legacy of the senator to address these issues. And I like what Roger Marks said in a lunch we had a short time ago, and that is focusing on specific issues and focusing on action steps that can be taken to address these issues and reduce the prospects for instability, and for doing the right thing to help people around the world have access to clean water for all the reasons they need to have that. My colleague Craig Gannett, who's the vice president of the foundation, who has a law practice in Seattle that is focused on energy and natural resources. Both Craig and I were fortunate to work for the senator, staff him, when he was chairman of Senate Energy and Natural Resources. So this is an issue that's important to us. We're very pleased to be here partnering with the Wilson Center on this issue, and I'd like Craig Gannett, if you would, to come up and focus just a little bit more on those specific issues. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. 2 minutes of historical context. The first week I arrived in D.C. to work for Senator Jackson on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the issue that he first handed me was to help rewrite the Reclamation Reform Act of 1902, which governed the Western federal water policy for the 17 Western states. And back then, interstate conflict was Colorado versus Arizona, and dangerous foreign actors included Barry Goldwater. But we did manage to enact legislation the following year. It became the Reclamation Reform Act of 1982, another data point that we were able to enact legislation the year after the problem was identified. But the big underlying problem that we did not address was the Ogallala Aquifer, which underlays 8 of those 17 western states and was in decline at the time. This is 35 years ago. Since then, we have utterly failed to arrest that decline. And if that aquifer reaches bottom, you will take roughly $20 billion of food and fiber off the world food marketplace with all sorts of national and international consequences. And if we were to leave the Ogallala Aquifer alone to recharge naturally, it would take a mere 6,000 years. So that's what we're doing domestically, which is not anything to particularly look up to. We are not a beacon for the world in terms of water management. Better than many others, but not where we should be. So now we're facing all those issues plus 2 exacerbating factors. One is climate change, which wasn't an issue back then, and the other is we're trying to do it overseas, where rule of law is a fundamental issue. It's the old Ginger Rogers joke about doing everything Fred Astaire did but backwards in high heels. That seems like a fitting analogy for trying to do what we're not able to do in the U.S. to do it successfully overseas. And so as a result, there are all these fallout consequences, including the fact that we have 65 million forced immigrants throughout the world, equal to the population of France or California and Texas together. And so we have a lot to get done. And as John said and Roger Mark said earlier, hopefully this conference will tee up ideas that are not only interesting and intellectually satisfying, but that will lead to actual on-the-ground improvements that will make a difference in people's lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. And interesting for us to continue to think about how we can continue doing it backwards in high heels. So, when we bring the Jackson Foundation together with us here at USAID and at the Wilson Center, I always think that we're bringing the 2 Washingtons together. So it's always a good an honor and a privilege to do that. And I think a good reminder from both John and Craig about looking at what are the underlying problems, what are the national and international consequences, what does it mean in terms of exacerbating factors, and what does it mean to practical applications for current realities like displacement. So I think, thank you again, and with that important framing, I'll ask the panelists for the first panel to come forward and join me at the podium so that we can get started. Thank you. So as we prepare to get started with the first panel, we are really excited to have this discussion today because it is very much connected, we think, to ongoing conversations at various levels, from looking at small communities to international organizations and networks of decision makers. It really is becoming more and more difficult to talk about climate change without touching on the impact of climate change and water and the potential security ramifications. So just last month, I know many of you are aware and familiar with the report that was released by the White House, the presidential memo, which underscored the need to address climate change-related impacts on national security. And the release of that presidential memo came just months after the release of a World Bank report that identified water as the climate problem. So we recognize that there is a resurgence on the talks of climate change concerns, connections between water, conflict, and opportunities for cooperation, but they're not new. So we want to have a sense of how we can look at these issues with a new lens today. And we're quite pleased to have a number of experts looking at these issues over time. And they come from diverse backgrounds, including defense, development, academia, and the intelligence communities, and are working at different levels of decision-making and at different scales. So with our first panel, we want to have a broad overview of the potential risks of increased water stress and how these risks connect to U.S. strategic interests. So what are the risks and how they connect to U.S. strategic interests, and what it means for international security and conflict. So we want to look from how can we move from risks to responses, and we'll invite the panelists to look at opportunities for cooperation and innovative policies that address water insecurity. In our second panel, we want to build on this initial conversation and have a deeper dive into how these issues are playing out in specific regions and how they connect to other key challenges on the ground. So we're looking forward to really an engaging discussion, and very pleased to have colleagues who are joining us also from Thailand and Kenya who have come to be with us and be part of our discussion today. Because this is being webcast live, we also have a number of colleagues who are following us on social media. So just for your purposes and those of you who are tweeting, the event hashtag is hashtag water security in one word. Hashtag water security is one word. So as we move to our discussion with our colleagues on our first panel, we're quite pleased to have with us a number of colleagues. We have Ken Conker, who's currently a public policy fellow here at the center and is a professor at the School of International Service at American University. Sherry Goodman, who is also a public policy fellow here at the center and is a former Deputy Under Secretary for Defense with a focus on environmental security. Chris Holmes, who is a Deputy Assistant Administrator at the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education and Environment and Global Water Coordinator at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Rod Schoonover, who is the Director of Development and Natural Resources at the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, and Lieutenant General Jeffrey Taylor, who is a Global Fellow at IBM Center for the Business of Government, Vice President of Global Sector Policy, Global Business Services. So quite an impressive range of expertise and background. So thank you very much. And Rod, if that's okay, I wanted to start with you. So we know through the NIC that there was a 2012 water assessment looking at some of the risks, and I wonder if you could give us your perspective now as you're looking at the risks related to water security. From your perspective, what do you see as the principal risks emerging right now?
Thank you. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center. There's been a lot of talk about climate change appropriately in the last couple months. I think it's really important, however, to start with the human piece of water insecurity. That's at least how the National Intelligence Council perceives it. And just a number of stresses to global water security. I would put water management and consumption at the very top. As a stress. Agriculture being fed by aquifers that do not recharge is a short-term solution, but a long-term difficulty, maybe a severe difficulty. If you turn to municipal systems, leakage and loss, these are unsexy topics, but they're critically important. I would say the continued use of water-intensive crops in regions of the world where water is already stressed. You have to look at population growth in areas that, that are already either water stressed or sitting on the coast. I would talk about current. Thank you. Rather than future climate change, I think we should acknowledge current climate as an issue, especially in parts of the world that are experiencing persistent droughts, the Middle East, Africa. So yes, I'm going to get to climate change, which is a very important one, but we should recognize that we have stresses already on the system. I mentioned sea level rise. Sea level rise mixed with a number of countries that are subsiding, or pardon me, a lot of cities are starting to sink disproportionately because of the overpumping of groundwater. And so those two things combined, sea level rise and subsidence, means that some of these cities may be affected well before we expect. And of course, when you talk about sea level rise, there is your climate change, current and projected impacts. And then turning to future climate change. All of those problems being, I think, really challenging, especially when you consider that water is used in so many different sectors, not just agriculture, not just drinking, but energy, transport, that having climate change on top of it and not a linear change. Pardon me, I'm a scientist by training, so if I fall into nerd speak, my apologies. But the stress from climate change is going to be nonlinear, unpredictable, geographically variant, also variant in time. So all of those things combine to have a risk to water security. I'll just add one more, and it's the idea of infrastructure. Infrastructure, civil engineering has long been a way to help control Mother Nature and harness it for society. I'm not going to talk about dams. I think that's a mixed bag, but turning to desalination, which is really a lifeline for a lot of countries and societies living in places that are becoming increasingly more difficult. That's the good news part of desalination. I think we are, in the intelligence community, beginning to see when you install single points of failure in, say, the Middle East, you may be producing more targets for security incidents. So that's just a flavor. I didn't even want to be exhaustive there. I just wanted to hit some key themes as we see it.
Great, thank you very much. So that's quite a long list.
We know how to bring the bad news.
Yeah, but rather, as you say, focus on the human piece, not looking just at current climate, but future, and recognizing this non-linear dimension, unpredictability, and variance in time and geography. So, Jeff, I wonder if I could ask you to build on what we heard from Rod. How are you looking at these threats, and how are you seeing this from a security lens?
So I think first off, it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And I particularly enjoyed the lead off about my home state of Arizona, where water is absolutely very important to us, as it should be to everyone in this room. But when I look at the principal risk to water security, I think first and foremost, in any natural resource, it's the fact that we have still, believe it or not, folks that are unaware or worse, indifferent to the challenges and problems of water security. The growing demand for water is certainly due to population growth, development, reductions in water in terms of quality and quantity, climate change, drought, pollution, all those things affect that. So the problem is water security sits at the nexus of environmental policy and international relations. And the issue is only going to grow more pressing as climate change accelerates and populations continue to grow. When we just look at the stats alone, and my background, I apologize, is in engineering. We just look at in total, freshwater usage has increased 199% around the world since 1900, tripling in annual usage. So that's tremendous. But we have to think actively about water supplies and plans for water security from three potential sources: the physical water scarcity, economic water scarcity due to a lack of infrastructure and because of financial or technical constraints, and the third is institutional water, basically shortages due to the failure of institutions that are in place to either ensure reliable, secure, or equitable supplies of water to the user. All three forms of these scarcity are observed worldwide, and as we discussed in an earlier session today, an estimated 21 of the world's 37 largest aquifers are currently being overexploited. So the unsustainability of existing water demands is huge. And again, I can only point to my own state of Arizona, where this is a domestic challenge. But I think in piling on to what Rod already said, that's how I see the issues right now associated with risk.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I think this question of physical, economic, and institutional water scarcity is a very important framing. You started off your comments by saying that folks are unaware or indifferent to water security. Could you talk a little bit more about that? When you say folks, who do you mean? And why do you think that they are unaware or indifferent?
Well, I think the fact that it often takes, so the sad part, so when we operate in the human domain, so I'm going to pile on what Rod said, so forgive me for my Army background, but when we look in the Army and we look at different domains, one of the domains we recognize is as we integrate different capabilities in the armed forces, we have to recognize that it's the human domain that dominates, and we often forget about that. Well, when we look in the human domain, it often seems to take a crisis before we respond as human beings, and I'm not picking on any one country or any one territory or any one state, but whether it's a security issue in terms of physical security or in this case, whether it's water security, it often takes a crisis for us to respond. It is just our history as people. And I think the challenge is how do we, and this was talked about in the earlier session today that I know many of you weren't able to participate in, but how do we communicate better the linkage between the need to recognize we must do something now versus waiting for something more severe to happen, and how do we connect those dots? And I just think it's our human nature, especially in terms of policy, that we often don't correct things until it becomes a crisis.
Great, thank you. So, Chris, I wondered if I could come to you now and build a little bit on what we heard from Jeff. So he's talking about these different types of water scarcities and very often being in a crisis mode response. I wonder if through your work at USAID, you can tell us a little bit more about how you are envisioning these risks and to what degree you're able to be anticipatory in looking at these risks, so moving above and beyond a crisis mode response. And how are you helping us to better communicate the need to do something now?
Thank you very much. I've not been in a session moderated by you, but you're very good at this. In fact, I can't answer your questions. So the theme of that's been expressed so far deals with a sense of risk and the sense of enormous vulnerability and the sense of crisis. And crisis is a motivator. So at AID, we are always in the process of looking very long, in part because of the nature of our programming cycle. We begin thinking of something in year one, and it may be year 8 when the project is actually on the ground, when you go through all the different kinds of work towards it. And we look long, and that's kind of a psychology of the organization. But at the same time, we search for evidence on which to base our decisions. And what we find is that we're dealing with these enormous unknowns, as it relates to the impact of climate change and as it relates to shifts. So to get information, we've increasingly turned to one of the great strengths that we have in the United States, which is our remote sensing systems and our data collection systems. We rely and we help develop and use a series of systems, and the most notable ones, which engage many other agencies, NASA, NOAA, USGS, principally, one on something known as the Famine Early Warning Systems Network. And that system basically is set up to provide projections on food insecurity or food security. And it's based on vegetation analysis, soil analysis, a number of other factors. And it's been coupled more recently with a system called the GRACE system, which provides analysis on water as a mass. And based upon water as a mass, you can then do subsets to help you better understand such matters as the health of aquifers. Yet, where we worry a lot is that there's no technology that can really give us a great fix on the long-term sustainability of water supply, either at the point of use, the well, or at the watershed itself. And so that is a huge problem. So you're dealing in a business of a global threat where you're dealing with not enough desired data, yet it's pretty good. We also have something we deal with known as the Himalayas High Mountain Analysis System, where we look at glacial melt and snow melt in some 12 countries that are dependent upon the Himalayas. And then we do the analytics related to its impact on river flow, which has tremendous development impact on the downstream countries. And finally, we work with a NASA system called the Severe system, which does projections and imagery and also training for people in developing countries to use that knowledge. So what I wanted to stress is that we're part of a global effort to build up a far better understanding of the dynamics of our planet, particularly as it relates to water and climate. And there are many pieces out there that I haven't mentioned, and there are also many pieces that we probably don't even know about that are kind of there and are being interwoven, kind of as we speak. Yet, while we have the advantage of satellite imagery, in many ways what counts is being on the ground, and what do you hear on the ground related to these risks and how to be anticipatory. So we are an on-the-ground entity. We rely tremendously on non-governmental organizations that help implement our programs throughout the world. And we are obviously concerned because the situation that we face is not only being in areas which are water short, but we're in areas where the quality of the soil is wretched. And we worry about the increased salinity of soil content. And in terms of solutions, and to be anticipatory, we are very interested and we support technologies that enable crops to be produced in parts of the world which have high degrees of salinity. So at this point right now, we're working in Pakistan with a potato that we worked with the Dutch on developing that can operate in 36% salinity. And Pakistan's potato belt, which is parts of it have been crippled by highly saline soil. I don't know how to express it for those who haven't really spent a huge amount of time in developing countries. And you don't sometimes really need to spend a lot of time to get it. You can just go into a country quickly and you come back shocked by the huge need and the poverty and the lack of employment. Doris Cabrera is here today, who was, where are you, Doris? There you are. Who knows much more than I do and who was a superstar for World Vision, and we did a lot of work way up, and I was with her in Kenya in the northwestern parts of Turkana, and she is now implementing a program that AID has up in the arid and semi-arid lands in northern Kenya. And I mention these because the challenge of the problem of dealing with the on-the-ground reality once you get the data is just huge. Because it's not just a matter of providing water, it's a matter of providing a sustainable way of living, ultimately, and that's a whole other conversation. So we are anticipatory. We use not just technology, but we use experience. There are tools that have to be developed to do this, and there are many, many. We have one tool that we've been developing with the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a toolkit that we've been using to look at the intersection between water and conflictual situations or conflict-prone situations that we find has been very helpful. In much of that work, in terms of on-the-ground knowledge, particularly as it relates to situations where it's not just the environment that's being stressed, but it's humans that are being stressed in terms of how they relate with one another and how that might enter into conflict. We're finding that some of the measures the Wilson Center has been developing, we with them, really look for collective solutions and bringing people together on the ground, sometimes using the data. The best of all examples, and then I'll stop on doing all of this in terms of on the ground and 23rd century data dealing with 7th century conditions, has been in southern Ethiopia, where we use these systems I've been talking about collectively to basically enable organizations which were working on the ground to go to communities and say, it's our hunch there's going to be a severe drought, and we can advise you of doing the following things, not the U.S. government, but the local groups. And one of the things they advise communities to do in Ethiopia in this case was to do commercial destocking, which is basically sell off half of your livestock so you have enough cash to handle the crisis and to be adaptive, and that was successful. So this intersection between these enormous technological blessings which we have in this country, coupled with people who just do the day in, day out work of trying to understand the problem on the ground and taking that knowledge and applying it to sustainable solutions has become a critical way in which we operate.
Thank you very much. So, Sherry, I wanted to come to you next. And Chris has made a very compelling case. It's important to have a long-term perspective. It's important to think about technology and innovative solutions, remote sensing and other tools. It's important to look at global threats, to have a presence on the ground, to build on the experience and move that into practical applications. I was quite intrigued that he mentioned looking at the Himalayas and high mountain systems. And I will ask you a question that you may have heard before, which is, if we look at U.S. security interests, why? Why are we looking at these issues, for example, in the Himalayas, in terms of U.S. security interests? How does this come back to us? Why is this important for us to be looking at, examining, and addressing?
Well, thank you, Roger Mark. And I want to start first by thanking the Jackson Foundation for your support here and engagement. I feel very close to the Foundation's founder in spirit and legacy, as I served on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff when Senator Jackson was still in the Senate, and knew well of his bipartisan traditions, his support, his leadership for national security and natural resources, as it was called really in those days, and have tried through my own work to really in many ways live that legacy of advancing national security and environmental security, now climate change, and now we're bringing water into the conversation. And so, Roger Mark, in answer to your question, water is, sort of is the front line of climate change. It's what every report that you see identifies as the sort of first and foremost effects we see from a climate changing world. It was identified back in the very first CNA Military Advisory Board reports, the very first National Intelligence Council reports on climate insecurity, and their 2012 National Intelligence Assessment. And even in the most recent report, the 2016 report on the national security risks of anticipated climate change, states from the NIC that over the next 5 years, the security risks for the United States linked to climate change will arise primarily from distinct extreme weather events and from the exacerbation of currently strained conditions like water shortages. So let's take the Himalayas as that example. Then what you have there is a region that is experiencing rapid glacial melt caused in large measure by climate change, a very populous region with countries that are already unstable. Think of Pakistan, India. This affects China as well. And there are regions within these countries, such as Kashmir, that have consistently been a focal point for instability. Now you combine it with nuclear arms, conflicts between India and Pakistan that have persisted, of course, over many decades, the terrorist threat, and then combined with in the recent years, flooding, extreme flooding that Pakistan has experienced. So you have a sort of cauldron of risks that are building up here, and we don't know exactly where that tipping point is that could sit, but we seem to be getting increasingly close to it, which is why Pakistan is a country of great strategic importance to the United States. And so when it is experiencing challenges related to water and being able to sustain its population, that is of concern to U.S. planners, to the military, to U.S. security analysts, and so that is a reason that we need to not wait until this becomes a crisis, but to be thinking through now, as Chris at USAID already is with his partners in development, in diplomacy. But we need to have a holistic approach that thinks strategically about how to address and confront this challenge. The climate architecture that's been put in place through the Paris agreements is part of the solution, but it's not by any means the whole solution, because we're not even sure we'll get to the 2 degrees with that architecture, but it helps move us. But we're going to need more immediate solutions that address the challenges of water and sanitation today, of agricultural techniques. I think Pakistan is among the most water-intensive countries in its agricultural sector in the world, and that poses additional challenges.
Thank you very much, Sherry. So Ken, I wanted to come to you. Sherry has spoken about pockets of instability at a subnational level and has also talked about this cauldron of risks. And I wonder, from your perspective, if we can move a little bit from looking at risks and instability and insecurity to opportunities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about opportunities for cooperation around water and how that may relate to the discussion we've been having so far.
Sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak. And it's always fun to be the 5th speaker, where the first 4 get to queue up all the problems, and then you get said, so what do we do? So what do we do? Well, the first thing I would say is that when we start talking about water in the context of security, we're immediately drawn to a conversation about conflict. And that's often framed in terms of scarcity of water and a real zero-sum game around water, where scarcity begets grievances, which beget instability and conflict. And certainly I think that's part of the story. But when we step back, I think the larger frame is really one of uncertainty and of managing risks. And in that context, I think the good news is that there are a lot of cooperative opportunities. There are severe barriers to tapping them, but certainly we have to try. So I think I'll answer your question on 2 different levels. First, I'll say a little bit about at the interstate level in terms of shared river basins and international law and institution building, where there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of opportunity to do it. And then second, I'll step down to the level where people live in terms of public health and livelihoods and the Sustainable Development Agenda, where, again, I think there are a lot of opportunities that we can tap. There are 276 internationally shared watercourses in the world. Fewer than half of them have any kind of an international accord, a treaty, some sort of a legal arrangement. Fewer than a quarter of them have an accord that involves all of the riparian nations in the basin. So we have a very weakly developed and patchwork body of international law. When you look at the content of that international law, we find that most of those agreements are actually fairly static, inflexible water sharing agreements. I get this much and you get the rest, or I get this much at this point and you get what's left over, and so on. And they're really not the sort of dynamic institutions that we need to actually manage the problem. So we need to think less about allocating a fixed pie of water and more about sort of expanding that pie through sensible and cooperative management. the UN Watercourses Convention, which is a framework treaty that basically suggests the sorts of principles that countries should embed when they negotiate basin-level agreements: environmental protection, avoiding significant harm to other basin states, sharing water equitably, sharing information, prior notification of planned infrastructure projects in the basin, and so on and so forth. On one level, it provides a very good framework. It was really written in the pre-climate change era, and I think it doesn't deal with a lot of the challenges of adaptation and resilience that we face. So the challenge in international water law is really to create more flexible accords first, that do a much better job of mobilizing, monitoring, and sharing information. When India and Bangladesh signed the Ganges River Accord in the mid-1990s, which was a significant accomplishment to do that, they basically created a water allocation scheme that created fictional water, because that was the only way that they could get an agreement. And so they used a couple of the highest flow years of the preceding century in order to say how much water each country would get, and then they signed the treaty. And that's clearly not the kind of flexible agreement that monitors and adapts, and how will we deal with the drought years? How will we deal with sustained drought and extremes that become the new normal? So there's a lot of work to be done there. Second important element is a better impact assessment for planned projects and for planned uses of the water. Information in this space is often treated as a national security asset and is not shared by countries, and that can lead to a lot of charges and allegations about what various countries are doing. Fortunately, in a world of Google and crowdsourcing and all these other wonderful things that we're seeing, that's a position that's getting increasingly difficult to sustain. A few years back, when Lao PDR was proposing building the Shayaburi Dam on the Mekong, they did an environmental impact assessment and a cost-benefit study. It was done late, and it wasn't done well, but the initial picture that it drew was that Lao would benefit substantially from this dam, largely through electricity sales, and that the impact on other countries in the basin would be minimal. What that impact assessment did not account for was the downstream value of artisanal fishing, which was something that previously none of the governments really had any clue about how dependent downstream populations were on fisheries for their health, for their well-being, and for their livelihoods. So the Mekong River Commission did a study that completely stood that cost-benefit analysis on its head by costing out in very real dollar terms the value of artisanal fishing and the ecosystem services that sustain it. It was not enough to prevent the dam project, but it is the sort of analysis that we need to start moving toward much more systematically and building into our treaties and our institution building arrangements those kinds of provisions. Pre-positioning dispute resolution arrangements. We know that conflicts are coming, not necessarily in the sense of violent conflict, but certainly in the sense of contentious disputes that can disrupt progress, that can disrupt joint projects, that can disrupt building smart infrastructure, and so on. And so building greater dispute resolution mechanisms. And also adapting our funding streams to these kinds of more dynamic and forward-looking institutional arrangements. The World Bank has a practice of not being willing to lend money for a significant infrastructure project in a basin unless there's an accord in place. And that's a very, very good policy to have. Unfortunately, we sometimes tend to tally success as the getting of an accord so that we can then liberate the funding. And I think we need to start being a little more, it's the content of the accords that funding needs to be a little bit more contingent on. And then the last thing I'll say about the shared river basins is there are tools that have been created by the Paris Accord and the new approach to the climate regime that need to be mobilized in this space. We need to start doing the kinds of climate vulnerability assessments that the Paris Accords envision at the basin level. We need to start using the national adaptation programs. There was an audit done of the first wave of national adaptation programs. Not one of them deals with the question of shared watercourses. They're very much little national scale footprints that don't look at the dynamic flows across borders, and it's critically important that we start doing that sort of analysis. The second, and I'll be very brief because I know we're pressed for time. The second place where I think there's enormous cooperative potential is in the Sustainable Development Goals, which sometimes don't get the attention here in Washington that they need to. We really need to understand that for most countries in the world, this is the development planning tool. This is the way in which countries are positioning their commitments, their funding, their legal reforms for the next 15 years. And it's critically important that we recognize the opportunities that are created by that. The water goal, Goal 6 in the SDGs, is actually quite good. I wish that it had acknowledged the human right to water, which it failed to do, because that was a very contentious thing to do. But whereas the old Millennium Development Goal on water said, let's reduce by half the water poverty on the planet, the proportion of people who don't have access to safe drinking water and who don't have access to sanitation. This goal says, let's eliminate water poverty entirely in the period of the SDGs, and let's do it with a much closer eye to ecosystem services that provide the water quality that we need, and in an equitable manner that doesn't leave anybody behind. So the way the goal is framed is very, very good. The problem, I think, with the way the SDGs have rolled out thus far is that they don't take a sufficiently rights-based approach. We just had this past summer, we just had the high-level panel meet, and we had the first set of voluntary national reviews that countries are stepping up and saying, we will, sort of open our books and have an open review on a voluntary basis of the progress that we're making. And since it's the first year of rolling out the SDGs, it was mostly about what kind of arrangements that we've got in place. I would say that none of the countries that were up for the voluntary review had adequate participatory mechanisms in place. It's really important to remember that there are a lot of people on the planet for whom community-based natural resource management, when it's done right, is the most real and vivid experience of democracy that they have in their lives. And that's strengthening that is an enormous opportunity to get back to the real underpinnings of U.S. national security, which in my mind are always going to be democracy and prosperity for people. And so working with the water goal of the SDGs as a leverage point, whether we're talking about livelihoods, whether we're talking about gender equity, whether we're talking about public health, water is one of the real fulcrums for multiple gains across the multiple goals. But to do it in a much more rights-based and participatory sort of a manner, to collect data that allows us to see who is winning and who is losing as we begin to implement some of the funding streams, some of the infrastructure projects is particularly important. And a last point that I'll make, which may sound like a little bit of a stretch on a panel about U.S. national security, but I don't think it's a stretch at all, is it's critically important that we extend robust human rights protections to people who are advocating for this sort of an approach. There's research that shows that the number of environmental advocates that have been assassinated in the last decade rivals the number of international journalists who have died directly in the line of duty. And we know that that is not a small number of people. And so if we are going to do something in a way that leaves nobody behind and really gets down to that livelihood level, it seems to me critically important that we sort of defend the defenders of that approach in a very real way.
Thank you very much, Ken. So I'd like to open it up to the panelists. As we think about potential solutions in the opportunity space, could we talk a little bit more about what those are, in addition to what Ken has identified, and what are some of the obstacles? So who would like to think a little bit more about that? Potential solutions, opportunity space, and obstacles. Chris, we'll start with you, and then Jeff.
So, Ken, that was a terrific summation. I really appreciate that. So to segue to what you were talking about in terms of the SDGs and opportunities, we're governed at AID and throughout the U.S. government heavily in terms of our water thinking through something known as the Water for the World Act, which was passed in 2014. And the Act really encouraged us to think in terms of transboundary water management, water resources management, and water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, and look for ways in which you deal with these three sets of interventions, interactively. And I think a great opportunity is to really keep your eye on the water resource management ball, because that in some ways is one of the sine qua nons, because without the resource, you don't get to play very actively in the other two, to be colloquial about it. And there are many ways in which one can strengthen water resources management. But before getting to that, I want to talk a little bit about the water supply, sanitation, and hygiene intervention, because we were talking about goal number 6 in the SDGs. So I've heard Tony Lake talk, who is the head of UNICEF, that he feels that we will never get to the rest of the SDGs unless we can meet goal 6. He sees that as essentially the linchpin, and not only for the rest of the SDGs, but also as it relates to the empowerment and engagement of women and girls. And I believe pretty strongly in what he's saying. I think what, as people look at water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, and look at water security, what they always have to keep in mind, I think is very important, is the leveraging power, to use Ken's term, of these water programs. And just in the WASH space alone, these water supply, sanitation, and hygiene programs are critical because they enable young children and young women in particular to be able to get past certain major obstacles in human development. So, not the least of which, of course, is death due to waterborne disease. But the problem that I think is important to share with all of you, which people don't generally understand, is the problem of stunting. So, right now in most of our priority countries we deal with in our water strategy, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in India, the stunting rate is about 45% for children under 5. That means that basically if a child has had up to 6 severe cases of diarrhea by the age of 2, the chances are very high that the child will be physically and or cognitively stunted for life. And there's no reversal because, and I've spent a lot of time asking the question, is there a reversal? Because essentially without adequate iron at these early stages, due to inadequate nutrition, due to high rates of diarrhea, not being able to keep your nutrients in your system, the myelin sheath just does not form. And the brain goes through a process called demyelinization, the sheath around the neurons. And without adequate zinc, you just don't get the bone formation for a small child. So think about that for a moment. Some of these countries that have these massive populations, and you're thinking that 45% of their future is cognitively and physically stunted. I mean, that is horrific. So that becomes a leverage point. Likewise, there are other diseases that you have to essentially, in life, get by in order to be able to function. I mean, HIV/AIDS, of course, is the treatment alone is critical once you've been unfortunate enough to contract it. But if you can't keep the medicines in your system due to high diarrhea rates, then it's not going to work. And again, these water supply, sanitation, hygiene interventions are critical. It's the same thing with neglected tropical disease and helminths. But they start to act interactively. So you take stunting, where even you've seen situations where there have been high degrees of nutrients being introduced into a population, but you still see the stunting phenomena. And it turns out people think that's happening because they're getting helminths, children into their feet through cracks in their feet, because there's huge amounts of feces and other kind of waste in the environment, and they contract it that way. So the great thing about some of these interventions is they have a systems impact, and I think that is pretty critical. And then finally, education. The dropout rate of young women when they reach menses from school is high. Now, in some cases, it's a week or 2 weeks. In some cases, they never go back. We don't have enough of an evidence base, sadly, to really be able to document this to the extent to which we should globally. But that is very critical, too. So I just wanted to follow up on your point about the SDGs. The leveraging power, of course, for effective management of water on a transboundary basis and the potentials for conflict are absolutely critical. And aid has a pretty robust program in that area, and we work very carefully with the State Department, who do a lot of important diplomatic engagement as it relates to transboundary water management. But what worries me, to come back to the beginning, is what's happening to our watersheds and the importance to be able to protect them, because it's going to be very difficult to restore them once they're depleted, but not impossible. Not impossible. There is these needs that we are addressing are in some ways, on the one hand, they're inspiring because they're challenges that people in this room seek to address. On the other hand, they're enormously depressing because they're so difficult to deal with. But we've seen work that we're doing in the Tigray province in northern Ethiopia, where I have been and worked, where we've taken landscapes that have been absolutely destroyed, and we're supporting the efforts of the Ethiopian government to restore areas that were, at one moment, they were desert, and the next moment they look almost Edenic in their beauty and their productivity.
Okay, thank you. So, Jeff, what's possible and what's not?
Well, I want to start by saying, so maybe this is simplistic, and forgive me if it is, but the way I look at it, and the way that I experienced it on the ground as a soldier in many parts of the world, is water problems, if they are prolonged enough, relate to and drive social instability, and that will eventually result in political economic instability, and then it will absolutely become a security issue. And so I really do think it is that simple. Now, then the question is, what do you do about it? So a challenge, but maybe an opportunity, and I haven't really heard it addressed yet. I think I heard Ken mention the word data. And so a challenge and an opportunity is we have this wealth of data, knowledge, case studies, solutions that exist already surrounding the issue of water security. However, that information currently exists across a very fragmented, diverse organizations and websites. They lack standardization, includes immense amounts of raw data. It's difficult to navigate and to share. And so what we really need is a platform where big data can be integrated and cognitive analytics can be applied with providing shared insights worldwide to address the most challenging water problems. U.S. Water Partnership, I got to put a plug in for them. U.S. Water Partnership and IBM, we're actually working on that right now. You may have heard of Watson. I won't go into a commercial about Watson. I think there was just something on 60 Minutes about Mr. Watson here recently. But I think there's so many opportunities, and I say this as a recovering academic who spent all my time in environmental engineering and civil engineering. We can solve the water problem. We really can. I'm very convinced, from a technical perspective, it isn't that hard. To do it as you take in the human domain and make it economically viable, that's the challenge. And I think we got to start by saying, how do we share all the information we currently have? Because, you know, even though the United States is incredibly talented and leading in this area, in many ways, we're not necessarily the leader overall in terms of total holistic implementation. So I think you got to have that platform. So I just think that's one area that we need to look at. Whoever can control, manage, and integrate in real time big data will solve the problems. And I would argue all of the biggest problems involve big data. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So, Rob, I wonder, what are your thoughts?
Pass.
How pass?
That's a hard question for an intelligence officer. Let me start by, so the U.S. intelligence community does not normally provide policy suggestions. Just pulling it back to the U.S. national security level, two items that I think are possibly helpful to the discussion. Ken brought up the idea of disputes, which I think are inevitable. Disputes over water they're not just inevitable, they are happening. It's really what the outcome of that is. And, you know, a lot of press, a lot of books have been written about future water wars. Will countries go to war over water? Which I think is an interesting discussion. There are other in-between states that are also things you might need to look out for. For example, the West and the Soviet Union were engaged over decades in a Cold War without very much bloodshed being shed. A lot of these disputes, these transboundary water disputes, especially some of the more famous ones that folks in this audience may know about, have elements of a Cold War They bleed into the economic space. They bleed into the security space. And I think it's important to recognize that there are in-between states between violent conflict and just disagreement, which may actually be quite healthy. And the second point goes back to really this national security posture that we might approach these problems. Again, I'm not offering solutions. I'm dodging the question. But I think one of the problems might be treating these water issues as environmental issues. That is the normal way that a lot of Western bureaucracies are organized. When you engage with other countries, for example, that share the Nile or the Ganges or the Jordan, these aren't environmental issues only. There's, of course, an environmental component, but these are existential, cultural, religious elements. And if you walk in with an environmental approach, you're going to walk right past them or talk right past them. And so I think it's important to, when you engage with other countries, which a lot of our elements, certainly the diplomatic structure of the United States, tries to engage with other countries to keep world peace, right? I actually think that, the notion of, I don't want to say conflict, but I would not put conflict off the table when you go 10, 20 years into the future, for a lot of the reasons I mentioned at the very outset. But when you start to really keep the world peace over water, you should approach it with the proper framework and the proper government officials and outside support.
Great. Thank you very much. Cherry, what about your thoughts? What are some of the innovative solutions that come to your mind, and what's possible in terms of realizing those solutions?
Well, thank you, Roger, Mark, and it's I feel like I'm surrounded by these supreme national experts here on water and diplomacy. So really what I want to do is draw on what each of them have said and sort of point a direction forward, because I think where we are right now at the end of 2016, with the increasing recognition of water as a security issue, we may have the opportunity to sort of elevate water as a global priority. And that means drawing on a lot of what Ken has talked about here, that I would group under sort of advancing hydrodiplomacy. I love this concept of prepositioning dispute resolution mechanisms. Preposition is a very sort of military term, but we preposition our equipment for the next military operation, but prepositioning dispute resolution and sort of engaging with the potential parties in advance is going to be very important. Using the data that Jeff taught, getting the data bundled appropriately so it's not so disaggregated, and it being able to direct it to the right sets of challenges at the right time, I think is going to be very, very important. And then making many of the transboundary water arrangements that exist, either, as Ken pointed out, they're based on fictional water supplies, or they're certainly not climate smart. They don't yet recognize that climate change has changed the whole basis of the water sharing arrangements. And so we need to do some work to update those agreements. Now, the U.S. isn't going to lead in all of this, but it can be part of setting the stage, and its leadership, like on climate change, over the last few years, is fundamental to enabling these activities to move forward in a positive direction. And then finally, I agree with this point on some of these matters are we say it's climate security is too important to be left just to the environmentalists. We need they're important. They've pointed that out as an issue, but we need a whole of government approach. We need to bring in the diplomacy tools, development, data analytics, intelligence community, of course, as well as defense to really foster sort of a whole of society. And let's not leave the private sector out, because nothing's going to happen here without engaging non-governmental, both public and private sector actors.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much, Joy. Ken, any further thoughts on obstacles?
Yeah, so just to flag a couple of points quickly, I very much agree with Rod's point about, this may sound funny coming from me, about framing these things as environmental problems. I mean, on one level, obviously, the environmental dimension of this is critical, whether it's water quality or whether it's climate change or what have you. But one of the challenges when you start talking about, better hydro diplomacy is that governments show up with the environment minister in tow rather than the foreign minister or the defense minister or the people who can really move the dial on these things. I would call people's attention to a report that I co-authored with several other people who work in the water space that was put out a couple of years ago by Adelphi Research, which is a German think tank, flagging exactly this problem, that we've approached this problem as a development challenge, an environmental challenge, and basically tried to call attention to governments that there are lots of development benefits and environmental benefits to be had, and that tends to attract a sort of a second level of political prioritization that is not sufficient for the kind of reworking of this, particularly in the context of dispute resolution, because that is the highest of high politics. And so finding ways to promote that political re-engagement would be a good thing. I think the UN Watercourses Convention, which many countries have not ratified, but which has now entered into force. Vietnam was the country that put it over the bar by ratifying it on World Environment Day last year, which, by the way, the United States has not ratified, and that would be a good thing to do, although I'm not holding my breath in the current political climate that we will do that. So I think that higher level engagement, the lack of that, is one of the clear obstacles that we need to think smart and creatively about. The second big obstacle that I would flag is simply uncertainty, and not uncertainty about water, but uncertainty in the other conditions that you need to bring together. And so if you're trying to do water and energy planning at the basin level, and you start applying climate modeling, and you quickly realize there's uncertainties in stream flow here. And we don't really, so if you're going to build some infrastructure, whether it's sort of urban flood management or whether it's some sort of water storage, hydroelectricity, whatever it is that you're thinking makes sense for this basin, and you have a good stakeholder dialogue and you try to do this the right way, you can fairly quickly show that over the lifetime of that infrastructure, the uncertainty around interest rates dwarfs the uncertainty around climate change. And that cripples the possibility for sort of stable, long-term planning and investment decisions. And so climate change provides us with the opportunity, the entry point. I couldn't agree more with that point. What we need to recognize as we go through that doorway is that urbanization, the demographic shifts that we are seeing, the great financial uncertainty, climate change kind of has to get in line compared to those uncertainties. And that's the world in which we're going to build our infrastructure. That's the world in which we're going to create our policies. In my mind, that leads to it leads to a paradigm shift, right? Rather than trying to optimize when we roughly know what the conditions will be and we tap the economies of scale, we need to decentralize. We need to not put all of our eggs in one basket. We need to recognize that the ability to change your mind and head in a different direction as you accumulate more of that information 5 or 10 years down the road, that's got a real price to it. That's got a real value to it. And taking more of a risk management kind of approach to these decisions and accepting that we will be in highly uncertain conditions and planning accordingly, that's the paradigm shift that I think we are seeing in a lot of different ways. The International Institute for Environmental Development did a fascinating study that they just published a couple of months ago about households in India in a region that had been subjected to flooding. And they were able to show that the amount of money that very, very poor households were investing, often as labor because they didn't have it as cash, in resilience and in risk reduction, was on the same order of magnitude as the losses that they were incurring from flooding. And that's a good thing. But the kind of uncertainty that those folks face, or that the dam builders or the basin planners face, given the financial uncertainty and the political uncertainty around these things, often dwarfs the hydrologic and the climatological uncertainty. Reducing that, but also finding a way to make robust decisions when we can't eliminate that uncertainty, I think is one of the critical obstacles that we need to work through.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up. We'd like to hear from you, some of your thoughts, reactions, questions. My colleagues will come to you with the microphone. Please give your name, affiliation, and get quickly to your comment or question. So we'll start with you here, please. Just because it's being webcast. Is there another microphone? Thank you.
Hello?
Yes.
My name is Marina Giannis, and I work for EcoPeace. We are creating a center of water security here in Washington, D.C. We've heard a lot about government and governmental solutions, water diplomacy, and so on today. And we work very much on the civil society. The point that people are often unaware or indifferent about their water security is different from our perspective in the sense that when we go out and talk to people and really educate them about their water reality, then we open up a framework where people all of a sudden understand the interdependence between their society and other societies in the neighborhoods that they are operating. It also provides the opportunity to really develop solutions that go across conflict areas and might develop more of a network of understanding between different conflicting societies on a very local level. If you take that level and build it up so the community gets a voice and are able to develop solutions, bring it to the politicians and so on, then you can push the politicians also to make the right decisions and create increased security. So my question to the panel really is, how do you see your role in terms of getting the civil society involved in these more solid solutions that creates a transparency all the way out into the civil society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. John Oldfield with Water 2017. First of all, thank you for a great panel here. I want to take a quick issue. I think, Ken, you seconded a couple of other remarks saying that the prepositioning of dispute resolution mechanisms is the highest of all high political dialogues. I might go one step higher, if I might, and suggest that the highest of those dialogues is actually conflict prevention, not dispute resolution. But I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on conflict prevention throughout these hotspots or potential hotspots, using water as a means to that end. So, frankly, paralleling what EcoPeace just asked. Secondly, I'd highlight Amy Pope, our Deputy National Homeland Security Advisor's recent comments on we cannot just react to Zika. We have to figure out a way to get ahead of the next one. Most of these infectious diseases are at least water-related, if not waterborne. So interested in the Homeland Security angle there. And then finally, and perhaps if you can come up with specific suggestions, I think most people in the room are in agreement with what we've heard on the panel today regarding the threats and the opportunities of global water security. What should we be doing or preparing to do on November 9th to make it possible for the next president of the United States to essentially do what she already wants to do on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, is there another question? Yes, please. Up front here. The name? Yeah.
My name is Chris McGahey. I'm with Hilaria International, a small business. And I wanted to tie together a few of the comments that were made by the panel and then pose a question off of that. You mentioned the current fragmentation of the U.S. government's response to water and the fact that we don't have a U.S. water policy, and that policy emerges from crisis, and that historically the water crisis has been viewed as a chronic crisis. But I would argue that it's gone acute now. You have major cities that are running out of water. You have businesses that are closing from lack of water. You have water being used as a tool of conflict in Ukraine. You have recruitment by Boko Haram from people being displaced by the drying up of Lake Chad. So I think we have an acute crisis now. Do we have enough of an acute crisis now that we can drive policy?
Okay, great. Thank you. So, small set of questions you to consider. Looking at the local level, how can we further engage civil society to move towards solid solutions that build transparency? How can we move to more conflict prevention? How can we get ahead of threats? What will you say to the next president? And do we have a water crisis that is acute enough right now that should force us into policy action? Who would like to start with one or any of the above? Sherry.
All right. Well, let me see. The first question, I want to applaud the work that EcoPeace has done. I'm familiar with the work, particularly with the Friends of the Earth Middle East for nearly 2 decades with Palestinians and Israelis and Jordanians working on concrete water conservation and water-related adaptation projects as a peace-building mechanism. And I think that is a model for building sustainable security in the 21st century. Now, it won't solve the other larger problem in which those countries are faced, but it is very important and has saved the lives of many and is important. And I do believe we need to engage. It is a way, as Ken said in his remarks, to engage civil society at the most local level, because the solution sets and the particular mechanisms will all be locally developed. That said, to tie it into one of the other questions, which was, what should be in the 100-day plan for the next president in this area. And, we know that infrastructure is a crying need both in our own country, infrastructure improvement of many different types of infrastructure, that we need to rebuild our bridges and our roads, our water systems, our energy systems, and that this is a way to get America working again. And also to help us develop advanced competition. I think there's an international dimension to that. A lot of the challenges with water also have to do with their infrastructure. Now, that's I think we'll have to be selective on that and targeted, and it will have to be a public-private partnership. It's not simply asking for more development funding, but on the scale that was mobilized at the Paris Climate Agreement of several public-private partnerships, one through Gates and other investors, and another through the U.S. Department of Energy on advancing clean energy systems. I think there may be an opportunity to develop sort of the comparable grand public-private initiative on water that would mobilize resources, financing, investment, and ingenuity to address some of these major global water challenges, and also elevate the attention that this will have. And I think for some of the reasons that Chris points out, which are so compelling, when you think that 45% of a population would be stunted and that is an effect that continues on for a whole generation. I mean, that's a very fundamental security challenge, in my view. I mean, that's the kind of discussion that we need to be having at the highest levels of our national security planning, and have that integrated into that discussion so that we are building into our engagement strategies, not only our diplomatic engagement strategies, but in defense. All of our combatant commanders have theater engagement plans, and they look at how to engage with the countries in their region to advance our strategic goals, which are in a pre-conflict situation, really to advance engagement, democracy, and peace building with the nations in that region. And I would say that we should look at water as a great, not only de-risking the issues associated with water conflict, but the opportunities we have to address some of these great global challenges.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Ken?
Yeah, so that was a lot. So let me see, I just picked my way through this. In terms of what to do on November 9th, without prejudging the outcome of the election, Hillary Clinton gets this entirely. If you just look at what she did to elevate water in her years as Secretary of State, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, whether it's the intelligence assessment or the Water for the World Act and so on, I mean, I'm not concerned about a lack of understanding of the issues. 3 or 4 things that I think would make a lot of sense as parts of a pragmatic agenda. First, do no harm. That is critically important. If you look at where most of the actual violence directly around water is in the world today, it's around contentious infrastructure, or it's around changing the terms of people's access or rights as a result of somebody trying to do something to solve a water problem as they understand it. And this is where the conflict sensitivity tool, the USAID toolkit, is such a really, really valuable thing, but we've got to use it. I mean, we had a meeting here at the Wilson Center a few years ago when that was rolled out. We had a public discussion of it, and then we had a private discussion of it where on one side of the room there were 10 or 12 of us who know something about water. On the other side there were several people from USAID, and I thought it was the greatest meeting because they came and said, we want to make this a living, breathing, active tool, and how do we do that? And so the people on the other side of the room started saying, well, you know, it's just 40 pages, you got to have a database, you got to build a website, getting back to some of Jeff's points about data and information and so on. And we very quickly ran into this idea that, you know, people are so busy, I mean, you see this every day, people are so busy in the field that to actually kind of sustain the commitment and the focus to that sort of analysis, it's a big challenge inside the organization. So really kind of embracing that do no harm and doing the analysis. So it's not just climate smart, it's also conflict smart. That's one thing. Second, there's a lot of opportunities in financing, microfinance in particular, small-scale financing, risk-reducing financing, insurance, and so on. The G7 had a big agenda on this in 2015, when I guess it was the Germans that were chairing. It wasn't even mentioned in 2016. So it's coming back and having a sustained conversation. Now, there's some problems and some challenges in that space in terms of the approach that we take to that. There's a very good report that the Wilson Center did about, maybe 6 months ago or so, based on some workshops that were done here that I would encourage people to take a look at in terms of how we, underwrite the manage some of that risk. But there's a lot to be done in that space. A third thing would be putting our own house in order so that we enter the international arena from a somewhat more humble position. I loved the comments that were made initially about Ogallala and what we're not accomplishing. The International Joint Commission and the International Boundary Waters Commission, at the time of their creation, to manage our water relationship with Canada and with Mexico, respectively, were state-of-the-art instruments. They no longer are. And there's a lot that we can learn and innovate in those spaces that I think would be quite helpful. And the last thing I would say is water rights. If you think that land rights are poorly established and poorly documented around the world, take a look at water rights. And this has enormous consequences. Those poor folks in India that I was talking about who are trying to do disaster risk reduction in a space with no property right to the space or water rights of access, how do they plan? How do they make decisions on a household budget? How does a municipal government do exactly the same sort of a thing? So I think the commitment to do no harm, financing, putting our own house in order with our neighbors, and taking very seriously, which I know there's some things going on in USAID about this that should be supported and nurtured around really sharpening water rights so that people can then plan accordingly. That would be my November 9th agenda.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken. So, Chris, I'll come to you now, but I also have a question that has just come in. It's a Twitter question from Brett Borer, and he's asking, how do you think we can mobilize the interests of young people?
Well, I think one way you can do it is by linking up the interests of young people with the interests of young people in the developing world. And I think that if young people in grammar schools around the country understood how difficult it is to get an education, and then once a school is established, how difficult it is for women, as I said earlier, and young girls to stay in a school without adequate water supply, sanitation, and menstrual hygiene management, which is such a simple intervention. I mean, it's like nothing compared to the impact of not doing it. You would be developing a bigger affinity. I think another way to get young people involved is by providing information that they can understand. You know, this is such a vast subject to get your arms around, and that I really believe, and this applies to young people and people at other age groupings, that you need a story that people can understand, a continuing story as it relates to water, because of the complexity of it. You know, there's a great scholar at Harvard called Howard Gardner, who's written an immense amount on leadership, and one of his theses is that great leaders are great storytellers. And he doesn't say this, but conversely, I believe great leaders love great stories. And I think that where we have been absent a little bit is being able to take the complexity of all of this information that we're dealing with in these problems and not delivering information to great leaders or to young people episodically, you know, like, my goodness, there's a dam that's going to burst, what are we going to do? But more a story that goes over a long period of time regarding a certain issue. And I think people then can become engaged in the problem, and they can see at different points where they can intervene as it relates to that issue. So that would be my thought. I would say one thing regarding young people and regarding data and big data. I completely agree with Jeff that in so many ways the future is going to be determined by how we link these disparate points. And so to me, and this is probably not the answer young people, not everybody want to have, I think that in the education of young people at the grammar school level, systems thinking, you know, really has to be introduced at a much earlier point in one's maturation. Clearly, people in grammar school can get it on systems thinking, but they have to be exposed to it because we are talking about introducing an entire generation to essentially the importance of connecting the dots and the great excitement about discovering a dot that's not out there that you can connect. And they have all the computer-based skills, but I don't see the systems approach to problem solving and understanding being introduced at that stage adequately.
Great, thank you. Rod, any final thoughts or comments?
I'll take a stab at two pieces of the set of questions. One, whether we're looking at an acute water problem. You know, I note that climate change as a political topic has not come up in any of the debates. You know, this is part of the citizen push on leaders. I think that is often required for bold statements and bold action. The United States is positioned really well, despite all of the problems in the Southwest and the Ogallala Aquifer. It's still positioned quite well in the water sphere comparatively globally. And I think that's, you know, that's a good thing, but it also poses a problem with engagement on these issues and the recognition that that we may be in an acute situation. It's going to be less obvious to us as Americans. And second, it goes to reward structures for resilient infrastructure. So not just climate resilience, but I'll use that as an example. I'm not certain that there are many countries out there where spending more money on redundant infrastructure that will at least be partially required for resilience, unless you have a truly widely distributed infrastructure. There has to be some reward, some political reward for the boldness of action that policymakers would have to take. And I don't see many examples of that nationally. Again, I know how to bring the bad news, but I think that's an important piece.
Thank you. Jeff?
So I'll put on my other hat. So wearing my Harvard hat, my academic hat, the work I'm doing up there is focusing on private-public partnerships. And so I believe whatever the global problem is, security or lack thereof, migration, pollution, climate change, pick your favorite global problem, we can't solve those with governments of the world. It will take the public and private sector together to solve those problems. And so when I was the chief of the Army Reserve and CG of the Army Reserve Command, the first thing I did is recognize that most of my workforce were citizen soldiers who worked in the for-profit private sector. And so what I did is I created a private-public partnership office, which built upon my predecessor's creation of the Employer Partnership Office. It became plagiarized in a good way and replicated throughout the DoD. And one of the big things we did was get with combatant commands, and combatant commands recognized that they needed private, public, and as an academic, I want to remind people academic, because we forget about academia, and bring them into solution sets. So we would, for example, be looking at water projects in Africa and find it as a venue to bring together, what a great idea, the State Department and the Department of Defense to do something in the battle space that the combatant commander owns that would empower and help solve local issues. That's just a tactical example of what we have to do, and we have to do a lot more of it. I believe the private for-profit sector can do a lot more. And so one of the things that I'm looking at, and I'm also looking at this at IBM, is whatever products or services we provide in the for-profit arena, we ought to be focused on the bottom of the pyramid. Why? Well, if you won't do it for ethical, moral reasons, that's also where most of the consumers are. So whatever your motivation is, we have to find a way to help empower them to lift themselves up through products and services. And so I really think that there's a very important role here. But the challenge I found, when I was in academia full-time, when I was in government full-time, and when I was in previous life in for-profit sector full-time, is businesses are skeptical of government sometimes. Government is skeptical of businesses sometimes. Academia is got a different sort of challenges. I won't go there in this forum, especially with Ken on board. But the real issue is how do you integrate and bring them all together? Because that's the only way you're going to solve tough problems like water security. And so I think, and I guess I'll end by saying that's the wonderful thing about the Wilson Center and about this forum, is it takes these sorts of engagements in order for us to find a project at a time that we can work on together. So when I work with the private sector, when I was in office, and now from the other sector, if you start talking about programs and all these great ideas, my experience is your 5 minutes are up, okay? Because I can say this now, it's for profit. I have to look at what's the quarter return going to be. But if we look at a project at a time that would demonstrate the integration of some of the things we're talking about, and that's the way I think of as an engineer. We don't have to agree on a program. We don't have to agree on a long-term solution. I'm not going to policy because I'm not in policy anymore. But what I can do is I can say, let's do a project together where we demonstrate the integration of these values and these solutions, and then from that, success breeds success. So thanks.
Wow. Thank you. What a rich dialogue. I think coming into this first panel this afternoon, I was trying to have a sense of what are the parameters of these connections between water and security. And I think we heard that in a number of ways. Water is the fulcrum of gains across sectors. It was described as the linchpin, the cornerstone of strategic leadership. We talked about leveraging the power of water and conflict. And when it persists, it relates to driving social instability. We talked about that in terms of human impacts. We talked about looking at current and future climate change impacts. And we talked about the physical, economic, and institutional water shortages that feed into that dynamic. So a very rich sense of the parameters of these connections and why they're important. I think we built on that to talk a little bit about obstacles. Where are the barriers? Where do we need to really focus our attention and build on? We talked about certain sectors being unaware or indifferent to these connections. We talked about these connections at times being nonlinear, unpredictable, variable in terms of time and geography, and how that dovetails with a certain degree of uncertainty in other sectors. Can give the example of uncertainty with regard to interest rates or looking at demographic shifts. So how do we deal with that very dynamic environment? We talked about the lack of a human rights framing on multiple levels and what that meant in the context of the SDGs. Interestingly, we also looked at health and recognized that with the health impacts tied to water, you recognize the future of certain areas, geographic areas that is cognitively limited as a result, and the degree to which this ultimately is a security challenge. We talked about data stagnation and the importance of not sharing information, of not recognizing that disputes are inevitable and not preparing and planning for that, and treating water issues solely as environmental issues when there are cultural, existential, and religious dimensions to these challenges, and also responding in terms of just a crisis mode. How do we move above and beyond this crisis response? So quite sobering as we think of the list of challenges, but I think we also got to solutions, and I think solutions in at various scales. I think we talked about very practical solutions on the ground, the degree to which we can have more flexible accords, that we can look at the better impact assessments, that we can pre-position dispute resolution arrangements. We talked about funding streams and having adaptable, flexible funding streams, and we talked about climate vulnerability assessments. We also looked at the degree to which the SDGs are emerging as a key development tool, a development planning tool, and that we need to ensure that there's a rights-based approach in that context. We also looked, I think, from our colleagues, talked about the degree to which we can have education at the level of a community or civil society engagement about the water reality and what this means in terms of generating systems thinking. So we also made those connections in a very real and compelling way. We looked at financing mechanisms, a philosophical approach to do no harm, and how do you operationalize that? How do we put our own house in order? And how do we talk about water rights in a real and meaningful way? For those of us who want to create a narrative that's compelling for others, how can we tell great stories over time that gets our target audiences to have a sense of where they insert themselves in that process? And what does this mean for when we think of public-private partnerships around these issues? And what's the role of academia in that context? And if we take this up to another level, what are the implications for hydrodiplomacy? What does it mean for U.S. leadership, and what it means for whole of government approach? Wow, you guys are amazing. That was incredible. What an amazing first panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So I'd like to invite our colleagues who are on the second panel, panel 2, Water Spillovers, Regional and Sectoral Effects, and Chris will be moderating this panel. Thank you.